The book of Exodus tells the story of Moses and the Israelites moving out of slavery in Egypt to freedom in Israel. After their successful journey, Moses issues the Sermon on the Mount, essentially a speech crediting the one true God for the people's successful exodus. And there he says the following: "You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me." Do you get what Moses, or God, is saying here? He's saying that not only is he the one true God, but there's a stiff penalty for failing to worship him or putting any other potential God candidates above him. Worship him and only him, because there will be literal hell to pay if you don't. Well, this is the birth of monotheism, or the kind of religion most of us just equate with religion. The worship of a single creator God whose story and dictates are laid out in a book that believers are supposed to follow. Yet this is not the way most religions in human history have functioned. Most religions, especially before Moses' statement before the Old Testament, were polytheistic. Many gods were worshipped that came down from tradition rather than a holy book, and hence there were no single set of religious commandments that anyone was supposed to follow. Monotheism just is what most of us think religion is, so we don't usually notice how different these one-god religions are from the many-god polytheistic religions. But monotheism and polytheism function very differently, and that's what this video is about. Namely, I want to talk about the particularly modern form of intolerance that comes with monotheistic religions. When different religions get into heated disputes, even wars, over whose God is the true God, or when denominations of a single religion fight over how best to interpret their shared holy book, this type of religious intolerance, or really monotheistic, intolerance that inevitably comes from religions that worship one true God in the one true way. Polytheistic religions imagine many gods and allow believers to worship different gods in different situations, tolerating many different ways of life and worship. Monotheistic gods, on the other hand, hold that there is a single correct God and a single correct way to see and worship that God. And like what Moses said, this God is usually actively hostile to rival gods. Here's how biblical historian Bart Ehrman summarizes the polytheistic religions of ancient Greece before Christianity took over. They involved many gods. They were all about practice, not about belief. They had no orthodoxy or heresy, no doctrines, almost no ethical requirements, with a few exceptions such as prescription of parricide, and no sacred word of God giving instructions about theology or daily ethical practice. There were no trans-regional religious organizations or leaders. The religions, on the whole, were massively inclusive and highly tolerant. They principally entailed cultic activities of prayer, sacrifice, and divination. These are religions that would be scarcely recognizable in the modern Reformed synagogue, the neighborhood mosque, or the Baptist church on the corner. Yet they were the dominant forms of religiosity throughout all of Roman antiquity. So maybe a good place for us to start is to look at what these polytheistic religions looked like. Despite their differences, there are many commonalities in all of these polytheisms. In all of these places, many gods that people would worship were local gods, gods that one city but not another would hold festivals for. But this didn't lead to intolerance because polytheism gave no pressure to anyone on which gods everyone had to acknowledge. Sometimes participation in certain festivals to the gods was demanded of all, but this was more for civil than religious reasons. There was seemingly no pressure put on anyone to believe anything in particular about any of these gods. In some way, the world looked different to people in these polytheistic times than it does under monotheism. Under polytheism, the world was generally seen as a place of forces that sometimes clashed and sometimes balanced each other out. And this was, after all, the way the gods worked. They'd fight, cooperate, betray each other, in a way that represented how earthly forces also work. Classic scholar Paige Du Bois depicts the ancient Greek worldview under polytheism this way. The worship of the gods in the ancient Greeks and the Romans formed a huge self-contradictory universe where the divinities can seem both playful and brutal. It is very different from the universe of monotheism, defined at least officially as a cosmos of judgment, where a single god knows, watches, and judges all. Another feature of the polytheistic world is that the gods were all limited in their scope, each presiding over a particular domain, be it childbirth or natural disasters. Moreover, the gods didn't much care about human affairs. Humans might occasionally sacrifice or perform rituals to the gods, and they might pray to a god to ask for wisdom in a certain area of life, but gods didn't get angry if you didn't believe in them, and there was no such thing as offending one god by believing too much in another. Next came monotheism, the belief in a single god that should be worshipped to the exclusion of other gods. First, this happened in ancient Egypt, where the emperor Akhenaten proclaimed that Aten, the sun god, was actually the supreme god. Akhenaten implied that Egyptians should all worship Ra exclusively, but he never made this mandatory. And similarly, Constantine was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, and while he used state money to build Christian churches and destigmatize Christianity, he publicly, at least, allowed for the freedom of religion within the Roman Empire. Polytheism was still the religious preference of the masses, and shortly after both Akhenaten's and Constantine's death, each empire really reverted back to their polytheistic ways. It wasn't very long after Constantine's rule that Theodosius became the first Roman emperor to really make Christianity the mandatory religion. He destroyed pagan temples, used state money to bolster Christianity, and actively suppressed the worship of any gods but the Christian one. After that, it didn't take long, in other words, for Christianity to generate a certain sort of religious intolerance previously unknown to the world. Yes, the pagan world was violent and full of conflicts within and between nations, but they weren't conflicts that were based on any group worshiping the wrong god. The polytheists didn't see the worship of different gods as a threat, and when foreigners were conquered, it was often the case that the conquerors absorbed the conqueror's gods into their existing polytheistic worship. What made monotheism unique was not only the idea that there was one god that everyone should worship, but the idea that this god was a jealous god, a god that demanded the obedience of everyone. Jan Assmann calls this the Mosaic distinction, after Moses' Sermon on the Mount, where God proclaims that there is no other God before me. So for the first time ever, your neighbor worshiping the wrong God was a threat to you and the possibility of your and everyone's salvation. Assmann also notes that monotheism introduced the possibility of a religion based on a book of set practices, the Old Testament being the first actual book where the correct origin story and religious practices were set down in writing, a book to be read and followed faithfully by the devout. Before this, religions and their practices came down from myth and custom, which, because not written down, were more fluid and tolerant of variation. Lastly, monotheism conceived of a moralistic and a personal God in a way polytheism didn't. Remember, the polytheistic gods didn't seem to care much about human affairs, and while they could be prayed to for counsel and might demand ritualistic sacrifices from humans, they were too busy with their own drama to care much about what humans did. Also, because there were many polytheistic gods, none of their powers were unlimited, and each had a narrow domain of influence. And even then, each could be pushed back against by other gods. Not so for the monotheistic creator of everything. This was a supremely powerful God who, because he created humans, quote, in his image, cared a great deal about what humans did. He set down non-negotiable laws to be obeyed as written and tolerated no deviance, even from those who didn't believe in him. Jan Assmann describes this Mosaic distinction this way. What all of these monotheistic religions have in common is an emphatic conception of truth. They all rest on a distinction between true and false religions, proclaiming a truth that does not stand in a complementary relationship to other truths, but consigns all traditions or rival truths to the realm of falsehood. To be clear, it isn't that polytheistic weren't at times intolerant. Before Constantine, the Roman Empire, especially the Emperor Nero, was very intolerant of, very violent towards Christians. But there's an instructive distinction to be made here. Nero was intolerant of Christians not because they worshipped Yahweh. After all, polytheism allowed for the worship of many gods. The problem came when Christians worshipped Yahweh and refused to recognize the validity of any other god. And with Christianity, that also meant that Christians would often ridicule anyone who worshipped any god but Yahweh. Here's how Bart Ehrman puts it. The Christians refused to worship or even acknowledge the gods of the empire, claiming in fact that these were evil, demonic beings, not beneficent deities that promoted the just cause of the greatest empire the world had known. The refusal to worship was seen by others to be dangerous to the well-being of the empire and thus to the security of the state. And so the decision to persecute, which seemed to us perhaps to be a strictly religious affair, was at the same time inherently socio-political as well. Polytheism also seems to have been more tolerant of different ways of living. This is because since there were many gods, different people could worship or have more connection to one god than another. Some might, for instance, be more a follower of Apollo, the god of rationality and order, while another might prefer the god Dionysus, the god of sensuality, passion, and inebriation. But because there were many gods who balanced each other out, the world was more seen as a balance between forces these gods represented. Like the gods, people could be quite different as long as they balanced each other out in the social order. We can see this in how polytheistic Egyptians, at least according to Henry Frankfurt, dealt with the idea of evil. Here's what he says. But the question remains whether the Egyptians, conceiving goodness in the sense we have described, showed any preoccupation with the concept of evil. The answer is that they did so only to a very limited extent. They believed the universe to contain opposing forces in perennial equilibrium. Evil, then, had its appointed place, counterbalanced and kept in place by good. Frankfurt notes that for these Egyptians, ethics wasn't about doing what the supernatural gods will so much as about the worldly wisdom to do what the worldly situation demands. There simply weren't such unilateral commandments as the Bible introduced. For example, people under polytheism would probably justify not lying based on the practically and usually bad consequences of it. If too many people lied, society would cease to function because people couldn't trust each other. Under monotheism, not lying would probably be justified by appeals to the religious commandment not to lie. Philosopher Richard Taylor reinforces the distinction this way. The Greeks derived their ethical ideals, and with them their philosophical approaches to ethics, from human nature, from a consideration of human needs and aspirations, and from their reflections upon political life. We, on the other hand, have derived ours from monotheistic religion. And even though many persons, and certainly many philosophers, are no longer dominated by religious convictions in their thinking, our whole culture still views questions of ethics within the framework established by religion. So there we have it. Monotheism introduced not only the idea of a single God, but of a jealous God who demanded to be worshipped by all under the threat of damnation for disloyalty. And it introduced the idea of a single written and unchanging moral code that everyone was to follow, not because of the code's good effects, but because it was decreed by the one true God. In this way, monotheism created the very modern form of religious intolerance, where groups fight over what God everyone should be worshiping and what that God's holy book really means for how we should live our lives. To close, we should recognize that monotheism has done many positive things as well, chiefly among them is its ability to hold large-scale societies together. To the extent that society functions by keeping everyone's behavior predictably good, monotheism surely has helped with that. According to the psychologist Ara Norenzayan, monotheistic religions, what he calls the big God religions, enable very effective cooperation between fellow believers even when they don't know one another. And cultures whose members tend to share beliefs in the same monotheistic religions tend to be more cohesive. But regarding tolerance, this is a double-edged sword. Here's what Norenzayan says. Big God religions build trust and cooperation and contribute to intergroup conflict for the same underlying reason, that these pro-social religions foster social cohesion that helps them compete with rival groups. Social cohesion inevitably involves setting up boundaries between those who can be trusted and those who cannot. After all, and despite some theological teachings about universal love and indiscriminate compassion, a religious community would not be a cooperative community if there were no social boundaries. So, in some ways, this religious intolerance that monotheism ushered in is a function of one of its virtues. Monotheistic religions can bring people together in a stable cooperative group, but this means that cooperation is limited to in-group members, and those who do not share the in-group's religion may now become a threat. Perhaps this is why monotheistic religions have a mixed history of helping to create the modern world and expand human rights, while also engaging in holy wars and religious tribalism. At the same time that monotheistic religions have often expanded the amount of love and compassion in the world, and surely they have, the question remains whether all of this is purchased by an inevitable intolerance towards non-believers.